Hello, welcome to the Finding Solutions channel. My name's Tom, and today's episode is about geofencing for timekeeping. In particular, today we're going to talk about what the right and wrong way is to do geofencing in our view. And we're going to kind of talk about the technical details as to why that matters. So, for today's panel, it's going to be a discussion. We have myself, Tom, we have Ryan, Lydia, and Ben, and we're going to just talk through issues with geofencing and specifically how the GPS is used on the mobile devices in order to facilitate punching in and out of work using a mobile device. So, with that, we'll get started. So I think when we talk about geofencing and timekeeping, what we really mean is we want to confirm that an individual employee is at a job site that they're intended to be at. So this applies to field service workers, construction workers, cleaning companies, even manufacturing where somebody might be using their own device, or traditional white collar jobs. Somebody's using their own device and they're declaring, I'm at the job site, whatever that means, and I'm starting work. In particular, for example, if you're, say you're a construction company and going from job site to job site, maybe even multiple in the same day, but certainly possibly multiple in the same week or the same month, then it's really important to know that person isn't in their car on the way to the job site when they start their time clock, that they're actually at the job site. And so that's why GPS and geofencing is utilized for mobile time tracking in particular, is to make sure that people really are where they say they are. So let's dive in. The first step is we're going to talk about how does it work. I think in order to have an intelligent discussion about the right and wrong way for geofencing to work with time tracking, we really have to do a little bit of a discussion about the technology itself. I find as a technical person, there's actually a lot of misunderstanding about how mobile GPS works. And all of us have a certain kind of idea of how it works, but I find that we actually have to explain this almost every time we discuss it. And I have a picture of a cell tower on purpose. We all assume something about GPS, and we kind of have an assumption that it's always using the GPS satellites in the sky, and those are being used by your phone to triangulate using those sky satellites where you are. But actually, the truth is a bit more complicated than that. So all cellular devices, this includes tablets, cell phones, and many computers, use a similar process to locate your device and in turn locate you as an employee when you go to punch in for work or do anything. If you get an Uber, if you're jumping into a mapping application and getting directions, all the way to one of the most annoying things for me, if I go to watch a sports game, for example, an NBA game, and it sees that I'm in a blackout area. It's using my GPS radio to prevent me from watching my favorite team while I'm camping, and it frustrates me to no end. But that's the purpose of it. It's locating us in the world so we can know where we're at. And like I said just now, there's really a fairly easy to understand but more complex process than we acknowledge as to how it's finding us. It uses what's called AGPS, or assisted GPS. So this is why when you first pull your phone open or you pull a mapping application out, you might see a very large blue circle around your dot. And at first, you'll all notice that blue circle's quite large. It might be 1,000 meters or more. It could be a couple of kilometers or a couple miles. And the reason for it's actually really easy to understand. The first thing we have to know is to actually get a full GPS fix with satellites, it can take up to 30 seconds or more, because there's all these satellites up there and your phone has to try to figure out which ones to use. It has to have some kind of listening capability to know what satellites are in range, and then it has to choose the appropriate satellites. So the first thing your phone does when you open it up, in fact, is it checks for a Wi-Fi signal and for a cell signal. And what happens is it does a couple of things. First of all, you can triangulate a phone using cell towers. Many, many years ago, I guess over 10 years ago now, when we first started my first startup to do time tracking, we actually used cell tower triangulation exclusively, because a lot of phones back then were flip phones or so-called dumb phones. And they were dumb partly because they didn't have GPS radios in them. They couldn't do full GPS. So the best you could do is say, okay, they're within a certain radius of a cell tower. So you might say somebody's within 200 meters of the cell tower. And if you had a couple cell towers in range, you could actually triangulate them. So there is cell tower triangulation. Typically, your phone, your modern smartphone, is not using that same method to triangulate. What's really happening is that it's using Wi-Fi. It knows the Wi-Fi around it. Based on where the Wi-Fi's are logged, it can start to get an idea of what GPS satellites are in the area and which ones it should fix itself on. And it also uses cellular data for the same thing. So Wi-Fi and cellular data are both being used in conjunction with the device to try to get a faster fix for GPS. It's trying to speed up that time to get an accurate fix. It can also use, and in some cases does, that old technology of cell tower distance. So it'll quickly position you in the world by knowing what cell tower you're closest to. That's pretty obvious. So I know if I'm in the state of Utah, which is where we're at now, within a certain radius of a cell tower. And it'll give you that very rough location. And actually, in the operating systems of Android and iOS, as a programmer, you can know what kind of location you're getting. Is this a rough location right now? And what the accuracy is, or is it an accurate location or very tight location?
So
Ultimately, what happens? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Ben, please.
I was going to ask, when you like 10 years ago with the first startup, when you say rough location, is it like, is it depend on the cell towers there, or like could you pinpoint it down to a single building even, or is it still pretty rough with that?
Yeah, it was rough. So first of all, if there was no cell tower, there was no location. I mean, that's obvious, right? If there was no cell
Yeah.
coverage, no location. If there was no Wi-Fi, no location. But even when you got a location, it was fairly rough. I mean, it was probably a few hundred meters at best.
Okay.
And if it could triangulate, it could get a little bit better than that. Probably dozens of meters, but it oftentimes would be a couple thousand meters.
And do you need to have access, like once Wi-Fi came on the scene, do you have to have access to that Wi-Fi in order to use it to triangulate, or can it use
No.
the known ones around you? Just some stores Wi-Fi to help triangulate that.
Yeah, this is a good question, really good question. But Wi-Fi SSIDs are public, right? So every device can scan what Wi-Fi's are in my area. Your phone does it now. Just having a table lookup of those SSIDs and a previously known location for them can start to help you understand where you're at. Let's say you could read 10 different Wi-Fi's at this moment. Well, there might be a consensus among the 10 as to where those are. Because once you get a GPS signal, you can actually log that information. Hey, these 10 Wi-Fi's, I can read that they exist within this GPS signal. So it's this kind of the end actually fills in the data for the beginning. The full GPS signal is precise, and then you can know something about the Wi-Fi's that are around you and the cellular towers around you and where they are. Yeah.
Nice.
How this is actually done from carrier to carrier isn't necessarily provided to just regular app developers. There's probably a lot of details that are very specific and could be different than I'm explaining. But in general, the principle follows that you're going to go from Wi-Fi cell tower to an accurate fix with GPS in anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds.
Got it. That actually makes sense, because we had just one client who said that they didn't have any cell tower, but they were able to get the GPS position, and they didn't understand why, but they probably had Wi-Fi nearby or some building or something that helped triangulate that.
Not necessarily. So here's an example. 10 years ago, I didn't know the answer to this question. So as a curious person who is technical, my background is software development. I was flying in a plane from Utah to Austin, Texas, and I opened up my phone on the plane. We're 500 miles an hour, however fast we're going. There was no.
That's not allowed, right, Tom?
Yeah, come on, Tom.
Come on, geez. Are you sure you want to confess to that?
Actually, I heard a story that this happened. It wasn't me.
Oh, yeah.
This is a story. I would not recommend this at all, doing this. But that person, well, actually, let me back up. Actually, it was in airplane mode. Let's just say it was in airplane mode, because this demonstrates the point. But there was no Wi-Fi in the plane. There was no go-go hotspot or anything like that. So just to be clear, there was no ambient Wi-Fi SSIDs. And even if there were, we're traveling. All those, anything I'm reading is going with us. And so I was kind of amazed, but my dot moved across. I had to cache the map, so I had to download an offline map. I was completely disconnected, and my little blue dot was moving with me across the map. So GPS does not rely on any kind of data connection other than, for example, map data to be loaded as a trying to give you context as to where you are. But the actual GPS location doesn't require internet.
Okay, got it. So in that case, it could have been Wi-Fi, but it most likely was their phone was open long enough that the GPS could triangulate where they were, and then
That's right.
cool.
Yeah, I can be, in our part of the country, in the United States, it's there's some very remote areas where there's zero Wi-Fi, certainly zero cell coverage. And as long as your phone can find those GPS satellites, and basically all it's doing is there's a radio, it's listening for a GPS ping. It can use those satellites and the distance between your phone and those satellites to triangulate where you are on the Earth within a few meters if it can get a full fix. It's actually pretty incredible technology.
Well, let me ask you this then. What if I have a device and I have a worker that's going into a building that has 10 stories beneath the earth? They go in, there's no GPS signal from a satellite, there's no cell tower, but there is Wi-Fi. Will it use just the Wi-Fi and can pinpoint that? Okay,
yeah,
cool.
And it can be inaccurate at times for sure. And when I say yes, I am not 100% sure. So I don't want to say things out of turn, but I'm pretty sure that Wi-Fi alone can be used because what the carriers want, the carriers are involved in this, but the operating systems, Google, Android, and Apple's iOS, they're very interested in making sure you have a location. I mean, you could even use IP address for reverse lookup of location in certain cases. So there's a lot of ways to get location. In other words, there's some privacy implications of that. So privacy is a major concern, but the operating system itself wants to be able to share its location with the owner of the operating system, which is you. And so it's going to do everything it can to try to get you that location. And if one of these pieces is missing, it's going to try to do it. Certainly inside of a building is one of the most challenging places to get a location because of the problem with GPS signals, for sure. Yeah.
Awesome.
So that's kind of setting the stage. We have a major issue with location. It can take a few seconds to get a really accurate location. And sometimes, like Ben just mentioned, there are edge cases where an accurate location can't be attained. So how does that have to do with punching? Well, this means there are times where GPS can be incorrect, right? It's not the app maker's fault. If I have a phone I'll tell a quick story. I was using Uber and I happened to be visiting a client in London, and I requested an Uber and it had put my PIN. I just opened it, my phone. I was in a building before that. My radio for the GPS just turned on. That's to save battery. And it kind of put me like, I don't know, half mile off when I requested the Uber, and I didn't notice. And the Uber driver called me. It's like, I can't find you. And he probably said mate or something. I had to correct my GPS and have him pick me up. So it wasn't a big deal, but there are articles on Samsung's website, Apple's website for helping people troubleshoot when their GPS is wrong.
You can also see like Snapchat maps where all your friends are and stuff, and occasionally there'll be one that like shows them in the middle of an ocean or something like that for some reason. Meaning
That's
if they were on a cruise in this example and the phone didn't check in when they docked and flew back or something, it showed them somewhere else. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great example. I often will check in with some of my kids when they're not at home. If they're out with friends, we have ability to track where their phone is. It can take up to 30 seconds to get an accurate location. It'll give me a rough location and hone in because it's actually telling their radio to turn on and give me a location. It stays on for a matter of time and give you that location, then it'll turn back off. So it does happen. There are ways to guard against it. Good app developers will know this, and there will be kind of processes and systems put in place to try to mitigate these edge cases. So that's what we're going to talk about. So there is a right and wrong way, I feel strongly, to deal with GPS geofences. Most systems, in fact, almost all systems that are doing time tracking have a gatekeeper model. Whenever I hear the word gatekeeper, I always think of that old Lord of the Rings movie and this idea of a total gatekeeper. You shall not pass. You shall not punch in, you can't get to work or leave work until we know where you're at, dang it, because that's the whole point of a gatekeeper system. And so the problem is we have a strong view that a gatekeeper can actually lead to a couple unintended consequences. Whenever you're looking at security and fraud prevention, there's a spectrum. Like on one end of the spectrum, we have full security, full fraud prevention, 100% foolproof. The other end of the spectrum is zero security, zero fraud prevention, and anybody can make up anything they want. Your employees can totally just BS you and tell you they're at work and they're really not. But then there's some crossover between the two where we strike a balance. And if you don't strike a balance, then that full security system actually becomes just as ripe for fraud or almost as ripe for fraud, and actually in some ways more ripe for fraud in our view than the no security system. And here's why. If you gatekeep somebody from being able to punch in, whether it's GPS, which is what we're talking about now, but that could also be biometric, something like facial recognition, then if the technology has an edge case, and we just discussed GPS has an edge case, where it is fixing their what they call fine location, meaning accurate location, and it's got a more broad location. It doesn't know that they're at the location that they're intended to be at or that they're declaring at. It makes the employee frustrated. They grow resentful. I've showed up to work at 8 a.m. I'm on time. I'm trying to punch in, and it won't let me punch in. So, this gatekeeper is preventing me from going to work, but I get frustrated. I begin to resent the time system even more than I did before. If I can't punch in, I have to ask somebody to help me. I have to go to my supervisor and say, hey, I was here at 8, but it shows 8:01 or 8:02 because it wouldn't let me punch in until the GPS was fixed. Or I'm in the middle of the building and it never found my GPS. I had to go back outside. It took me an extra 10 minutes. All the while, I can't get to work, and I've made my supervisor the IT person. That causes supervisor frustration. So I'm frustrated. The supervisor's frustrated. Well, if the supervisor is notified that they can't punch in and they couldn't punch in until 8:05, what is a supervisor to do? The supervisor has to go in and they have to have access to the time system. The supervisor then has to manually change the time from 8:05 or 8:10 or 8:01 even to 8 o'clock, or they decide not to change it if it's a small, 8:01 versus 8 o'clock. But either way, the supervisor's frustrated. But most importantly, it provides the supervisor an opportunity to be tempted to commit their own fraud. Now, they would never call it fraud, but they are motivated to curry favor with the employees. They want the time to be tracked accurately. But if they have the opportunity to change time because of a gatekeeper system, then they also have the opportunity to fudge the time. If time is fudged, job costing is not accurate. You don't know which jobs are profitable, which ones aren't profitable. It leads to all kinds of problems. So all this stems from something like a GPS system not being accurate. It can lead to bad time data throughout the entire system.
And supervisors are just going to do the easiest, path of resistance, right? So is it going to be easier for them to just put in the time every time there's an issue or report the issue and get it fixed? Well, it's a lot easier. And then it just turns into a supervisor tracking system for time. And they're the ones that are putting the time in all the time. And so it just never gets adjusted or anything. So yeah, it turns into a slush fund for a supervisor who can potentially give Ryan some extra minutes for just being a pal.
Yeah, and frankly, I don't blame the supervisor. They're just trying to do their best. Their job description was an IT manager. They're trying to motivate their employees. But you said something I think important, Ben. They have if they're providing bonuses for their employees and using the time system to do it, then that's one thing. Like we're not anti-bonus for an employee. Let's say an employee deserves an extra 10 minutes of pay that day for whatever reason. That should be done, but it should not be the time system that is at odds with the bonus system. The time system should accurately record the time worked, because over time we know if you don't have a time system that's being used to punch in and out, you can be up to 10% wrong with that time allocation. And if it's wrong, how are you supposed to make business decisions? How are you supposed to know, like I said earlier, that a job is profitable or not? this rounding or supervisor changing of time could flip a job from being a profitable contract to unprofitable if it was tracked correctly. When the job comes up for negotiation, let's say it's a cleaning job where there's two buildings close to each other and you're borrowing labor, then one might be a loser, one might be a winner, but you might think the opposite if the rounding is such that supervisors are going in and rounding time. And that all goes back to the fact that there's a gatekeeper system for something like GPS. So we don't believe in a gatekeeper system.
I'm going to
And
say, Tom, too, that it seems like even honest, like we consider honest people, I think a majority of us we tend to round in our favor. So if there's ever a manual process as far as recording time, even the people that you would think are the super honest people, it's a natural tendency, I think, for us as humans we kind of tend to round in our favor. And that if you do that consistently over time, that adds up to be a lot for an organization. So if you can eliminate any type of manual entry, you really, you're going to save money and have accurate data like you're talking about.
yeah, I think that's a great point. Like none of us would ever talk bad about employees and supervisors just trying to do the best they can. It's just human nature to round, and over time, it's incredibly meaningful amounts of time being misallocated, both on the side in favor of the employee, and sometimes in the favor of the employer, which is a regulation and regulatory nightmare. You don't want either of those. You just want accurate time, for sure. So let's talk a bit about how do you solve this? If GPS is really not GPS, but it's this assisted GPS, which we just talked about. Our view, there's a right and wrong way to do punch security, and that includes something like location security. We're talking about GPS today. There are other ways to get locations. There's things like what we term micro locations at Find, where you can know if they're on the third floor of a building versus the first floor. And we won't take a deep dive on micro locations in this discussion, but there are other ways to get location. We do web punching. But if you're talking just something like GPS and you're talking punch permission, the real simple answer is you don't gatekeep it. You don't force somebody to have necessarily the most accurate location when they punch in. You just warn them. So you follow this exception versus rule mentality. 99.9% of people are honest people who aren't trying to defraud a system as an employee. They're just trying to get to work. So let them get to work on time. It removes the frustration. And one of the most important things it does is it removes the supervisor from ever being required to edit the time itself. The employee and the time system control when that time is entered. There is no need for a supervisor to change it. If there's a time where the GPS was wrong or where they are trying to commit fraud, then the system knows that. The system can generate an exception and clearly show that in the system to say, hey, this person's declared they're at job site A. They were really not at job site A. They were 100 yards away from job site A. If there's a photo involved during the capture of the punch, then the photo can become further evidence. Typically, these exceptions are fairly easy to reconcile. And then there's also some pattern. If the same person's getting an exception more often than others, you can actually talk to that person, try to address it in a more systematic way with training.
Yeah, for sure. It makes me think of a couple of examples that we've seen. One was out in Temecula, California, where they were trying to get a solution. They had guys they're construction workers doing concrete work all over the place out in the desert, and they a lot of times wouldn't have connectivity. And the system they had to use for punching was one where they just would punch in, and if they had to be connected. And so if they weren't connected, then they couldn't punch. It'd be in these remote areas they wouldn't be able to do it. So that was the first thing they did, is to try to test out any new solution, was throw it on a supervisor's phone and had him go drive out into the desert just to go see if they could make sure that they could record where people were punching and to make sure that they could punch while they were offline. That was another important aspect of it. So
yeah, that's a great point. The location service should work offline and just need the GPS satellites, as Ben kind of highlighted earlier, because otherwise you get into the same problem. If it's a gatekeeper, if you have to have data or Wi-Fi or some kind of connection to get GPS and to punch in, it's the same problem. it creates that gatekeeper where they can't punch in, and then it opens up the opportunity for frustration and fraud.
Yeah, the other one, the gatekeeper situation. Think of one up in Canada. They had employees that were texting back to the HR department, just frustrated beyond all belief because they're taking videos, they're sending photos saying, "Hey, I'm actually here at the job site, and it won't let me punch in."
Right.
For some reason, the GPS was off, and it showed they were outside the geofence, but they physically were there, taking photos, sending videos back to the HR person, and she was having to constantly expand the geofence to try to take in. And over time, she lost enough accuracy that she just turned it off. She gave up. So that, the gatekeeper approach just doesn't always work if you don't have great connectivity, especially for mobile workforce.
I think you're actually highlighting a phenomenon that I've observed, which is if you tighten security to the point where it's no longer convenient, then what you get is the equivalent of somebody writing down their password for their computer and putting on a sticky note on their monitor. In other words, if the security is too tight and it's not convenient, the person will thwart the security to make it convenient, and it's actually now less secure than where you started. And so convenience and security are actually intertwined, and it's very important that they're intertwined. There needs to be a balance. So it's a great story. So in other words, if they were so upset and frustrated that you completely abandoned the GPS system altogether and went back to paper, then it's the least secure of all, because frustration led to an abandoned implementation.
People couldn't get punched in, so they gave up.
Great points. All right. So to close here, as we kind of summarize, let's just summarize what we've talked about. GPS isn't always 100% accurate, no matter what your impression of it is. It's really good. And most of the time, it gets really accurate really fast. But because of the assisted GPS, there are edge cases where it can still be trying to find somebody. If you're using a gatekeeper system, frustration leads to a lack of adoption. It leads to the opportunity for fraud to be committed by the supervisors. So using a system that uses an exception model is a better way to go for time tracking. It's the perfect balance between that highly secure system with convenience. Then the employee always gets to log their time as they start work, as they're changing jobs, and as they end work. You get 100% accurate time. You get your cake and you can eat it too with security because it's sufficiently secure that it handles almost every scenario. And for those that it doesn't, you have an exception. You can do some business rules around those exceptions and try to identify any bad actors. And in that way, we feel that's the right way to do geofencing for time tracking. So thanks everybody's time. Any closing comments from you guys?
Oh, well said.
Yeah, well said.
All right. Till next time. Thanks, everybody.